It was a great mystery at first what was going on. I, like most members of the House, was hunkered down in my office. Uh, Most people had not gone to the House floor because of the pandemic. So I was watching on our internal TV system what was going on, and it was a mystery. All of a sudden, the session adjourned, the session where we were counting, confirming the electoral votes from the states. That session adjourned, and clearly something was amiss. But and then I began getting calls and texts from my friends at home. They knew more than I did, seeing what was going on television, and it, of course, then became apparent that there had been uh, an invasion of the Capitol by these insurgents, and that everyone had scattered, and the session had been hastily adjourned. I was never in personal danger. I simply locked the door and waited it out. And Most people did that. There were some people on the floor of the House, though, who were in truly frightening situations and who narrowly escaped harm. But I waited it out. I watched on that internal system until we came back in, which was hours later. But fortunately, we did come back into session, and we continued the count of the electoral votes that night, and we announced that Joe Biden indeed had been elected president. That was what would normally have been just a formality. I mean, the notion that this was some kind of national security event that required extraordinary means, we would have never thought that. Of course, we would have never thought our capital would be invaded. Even during the Civil War, that didn't happen. So it was extraordinary. And for days afterwards, we were processing what had happened and just how serious it was. But the at the moment, I felt safe and secure, albeit quite baffled and kind of amazed at what seemed to be going on. The first thing to say is that we did complete the count of the electoral votes. And so, what should have been a pure formality, a constitutionally mandated process, did continue. And of course, we then proceeded to inaugurate Joe Biden as president. But I would not minimize the effects of what we went through on January 6th. It was incredible to me that even after the insurrection, even after the Capitol was invaded, that well over half of the House Republicans still voted to reject the electoral votes from key states. And the next day, Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, very strongly denounced President Trump and his role in this. And we immediately convened an impeachment, a second impeachment. And in the book, of course, I talk about the first Trump impeachment and compare it to the Clinton impeachment years before. But the comparison of the first and second Trump impeachment are also significant because this time, for the first time in American history, at least a block of opposition members voted to impeach. 10 people, to be precise, including Liz Cheney, the number 3 person in House Republican leadership. So I thought at that point that we're not going to impeach. The partisan line still held. But this is different. This is so egregious. This violation of the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power and all the things that we like to think we stand for, that surely this expression of dissent would then take hold in the Republican Party, and they would move on from Donald Trump. That does raise another point I make in the book, which is that the country needs a center-right party, just like we need a center-left party. And if I want to see the Democratic Party organizing as a broad governing coalition now with Joe Biden as president, I also would hope for the Republican Party, a regrouping, where it's not a cult of personality, but it is a broad center-right opposition party. But that has not happened, and that's the major surprise, maybe nothing should surprise us after Donald Trump, but to me, I did think that the facade was cracking there after the insurgency, and that Republicans would distance themselves from Trump and their party would move on. Just the opposite has happened. And we're seeing the people who objected to Trump's role and Trump's fomenting of the insurgency. We're seeing those people marginalized. And I think that does trace back to the Republican base. It's certainly not a majority of voters, but voters that Republicans feel they need have simply not moved on from Trump and are doubling down in their defense of Trump. So the aftermath does include a big question mark about the future of the Republican Party, and of course the basis on which we're going to try to govern. The aftermath also, of course, includes a peaceful inauguration of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and the launching of an effort in the Congress with the narrowest of Democratic majorities to first of all offer relief to get us to the other side of the pandemic, but also to invest in infrastructure, invest in other elements that of our country, that some of which we would, of course, need even without the pandemic. We're long overdue for investment in transportation, in housing, in our water and sewer systems, and in our workforce. Many investments that are now on the line with the Biden program. And so that's another big question. You know, where does this leave us? Where does this insurgency leave us in terms of broad public opinion and the kind of support that might be given to measures to bring the country back? On the one hand, it does look like the ghost of Trump is not really. Trump's presence is still very much dominating the Republican scene. On the other hand, there might have been, and I do raise this in the book as well, there might have been, we will know soon, I guess, whether there's been some shift in attitudes about government. And the lesson of the pandemic, one would think, would be that we need a competent government that takes science seriously, that acts in the public interest, and that, of course, is what I would hope for. I talk about anti-federalism as a force in American politics from the very beginning, a sense that government is the enemy, that the governmental power and the citizen liberties are always opposed. That's a very, very constricting ideological viewpoint. And I don't know if we've moved beyond it, but that's really what's at stake now as we attempt to recover from the pandemic and invest for the future. Teaching about institutions, I think, is absolutely important, and one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try to convey that. So often we get from, of course, from politicians and pundits, a very personalized view of politics. And, personalities are important, certainly with a character like Donald Trump or a character like Liz Cheney, or, the personality factors are important. But what we depend on year in and year out to preserve democracy and to give our republic continuity is institutions which were set up by our Constitution and which require living, breathing human beings to make them work. And in the United States, we're sometimes prone to almost mechanistic view of democracy. We have checks and balances, and when something gets out of whack, then the checks and balances kick in. I admit I had some of that thinking myself as I witnessed the 4 years of Donald Trump and the violations of the constitutional barriers that I thought had been pretty much sacrosanct. And so the question then and now is, do the institutions hold? I do explore in the book how individual elected officials ought to think about this and ought to relate to institutions. I ask the question, what kind of member should I be? And there's a temptation in an individualistic political culture like ours, and this goes back to the revolution. It goes back a long, long time. There's a tendency to declare our independence of institutions. Politicians often put a moral cast on that. They are more virtuous than the rest of their colleagues. I mean, that's the implication. I'm the sole virtuous member among these 434 other bandits, and that not only is hypocritical, but it is also destructive in the end. Because if you have 435 members, each proclaiming their independence of the institution, each kind of dumping on the institution, uh, and not contributing to the understanding of how it works or what it's reasonable to expect, then your system is in trouble, and the legitimacy of your institutions and your constitutional system are in jeopardy. And so, I've come to I wrote this in the first edition of the book that we needed to think of ourselves not just as individuals, the kind of Lone Ranger ethic I call it, but we need to think of ourselves as members of institutions and to ask what our obligations are to repair and reform, but also to strengthen and maintain those institutions. Well, I certainly now have a new appreciation of that after what we've been through. It's a very good question. What we need to focus on and give more attention to in our politics these days and in the way our political system works. I talk a lot in the book about political institutions as opposed to simply isolated politicians, making their views known. So I think in our teaching and our thinking about American politics and probably small d democratic politics internationally, we need to understand the importance of institutions. In talking about the work of our parliament to parliament democracy strengthening project, I talk about Tunisia, a very fragile developing democracy. But what makes Tunisia different from the rest of the Arab Spring? Probably the presence of institutions that could at least be worked with, and that made a difference in navigating the early perilous years of post-autocratic rule in Tunisia. Certainly institutions are important. Venerable institutions in Britain, the United States, and other Western democracies. So focusing on that and understanding that as opposed to a purely individualistic account of how our politics works and what the forces are at work are. I hope in the book that people get a sense of public service and the importance of public service, the rewards of public service. And that's, again, that's not just a chance to use an institution or elected office as a platform for self-promotion or for a particular ideological program. But it's a chance, just to put it very, very broadly, it's a chance to help make democracy work. It's a noble calling to represent your fellow citizens, to represent the full array of interests in a society and help bring responsive policies together. So I hope the book does. It certainly gives an account of the frustrations of public service, but I hope that the possibilities also come through. And then finally, I have a lot to say in the book about education and civic education, education for public service, but also education for active citizenship. And that's a tall order these days. We have a lot of talk in the United States about the decline of civic education. But the demands of civic education these days are going to be greater. It's not just learning about the three branches of government and the constitutional system. In many ways, that has become that textbook view of the Constitution and of politics is being superseded every day. And I hope the book adds to an understanding of that. But we also need to understand some additional things. For example, the way Keynesian economics works. And that sounds like a high-flown term, but it's very, very practical. And what we're trying to do right now in the United States in terms of coming out of an economic blow, recovering from an economic blow rendered by the pandemic, and compensating for that, priming the pump so that our economy gets going again. Or the idea of collective goods. Goodness knows the pandemic has brought that out. If you have an absolute view of your personal liberty, and you think something as trivial, really, as wearing a mask violates that liberty, or if you have such an absolute view of religious liberty that you think some kind of prohibition against congregate meetings in the midst of a pandemic is violation of your religious liberty, something's really askew in that way of thinking. So, and education needs to deal with that. People who are educated need to understand how it is that sometimes liberty has to be protected. The liberty of everyone has to be protected by governmental coercion, as contradictory as that might sound. We need to understand that somehow economic prosperity might be furthered by, in the short term, going into further debt. These are, it's a tall order, I grant that. It is a tall order for general education to deal with these matters, but it's also very sobering these days, what kind of levels of citizen understanding we need to underwrite the role of government, what government needs to be in a modern industrial state, and to give us the kind of politics we need to work cooperatively, and nobody's expecting perfect agreement, but we need in this country very badly to transcend this kind of absolute ideological disagreement where the government is can do no good, and where the politics is a matter of politicians trying to outdo each other in terms of how outrageously rebellious they can be. So all this is a challenge for post-Trump politics in the United States, and looking around worldwide with the kind of tendencies toward right-wing populism in a lot of places. It's a challenge worldwide. Democracy is not necessarily on the march. And so our teaching and our research needs to reflect on why that's so, and what it's going to take for our democracies to recover and reform and move on to the kind of achievements that modern society requires.